What's your view on general champ balance design? For example, Flox taught me that there's value in fun over balance to some extent, even in a competitive game like League, as a balanced champ is worthless if nobody wants to play them because I'm fun. I do agree with him there from my own game designer perspective. My general perspective is perception is king. And so what I mean by that is I don't think the most objectively balanced game is the best game. Because if people don't perceive it to be balanced, then it doesn't matter if it's balanced. Players need to play your game and feel like it's balanced and feel like it's enjoyable and feel like it's worth playing. And if a bunch of players come up to you and say, your game's unbalanced, and then you like pull out the cat ears and say, well, actually, according to these data sets, it is objectively perfectly balanced, right? Like, that doesn't matter if it doesn't feel that way, right? And so, you know, things like win rate data and data in general and objective balance are all valuable things to think about and valuable things to employ when making a game balanced. But you can't just be a robot about it. You have to account for the fact that at the end of the day, the game needs to be perceived to be enjoyable and perceived to be balanced, which can be very, very different from it actually being balanced. So as an example of this, there are certain champions that will feel grossly overpowered if they are strong. Sorry, if they are balanced. And those characters might need to be slightly weak. There are certain champions that, if they are perfectly balanced, will feel grossly underpowered. Those characters might need to be slightly strong. And when I say feel's a really important note on this. Because it's kind of like, if Sona is OP in a forest and no one is around to die to her, is she really strong? Obviously, that's a little silly, but like what I'm getting at is like, if a character is OP and there's not a single person who thinks it's OP, does it really matter? Right? And if a character, and that's like something you have to think about, is there are certain characters who might feel balanced when being OP and objectively might be OP, even though like the majority of players feel they're balanced. Another thing I think about this is something a conversation I had like 10 years ago with Jag, the designer who made characters like Kaisa and Aatrox. And at the time, he was on the live balance team. And at the time, JINX was the strongest champion in the game by win rate by a very... Not in the game. The strongest AD carry by win rate by a very real amount. Back then, JINX was sitting at like 53, 54% win rate. And she sat there for a very long time. And I, as JINX's designer, was very concerned about that. I was like, dude, she's OP. Like, we need to nerf her. And I went and talked to Jag about it, who was on the balance team. And Jag turned to me and he was like, I agree with you that she's strong, but no one minds. Who would you rather take her place? Would you rather people play a bunch of Draven and everybody dies to Draven? Would you rather everybody's running around invisible as Twitch? It was kind of the idea that JINX being strong generally, back then, 10 years ago, was like, she generally created enjoyable game states. And so, was it all that much of an issue if players didn't seem to feel bad about her being powerful? And I think that was like a very insightful thing that he said back then, that I've kept with me for a very long time. It's just this kind of idea that like certain things that are OP can make the game fun. Certain things that are like powerful can make the game fun. Like another way to think about this is the idea that you should move players. You should match what is powerful in the game with like the game you want to create in terms of it being like an enjoyable game to play. So like as an example of this, it's like we could make split pushing one of the best strategies. Or we could make team fighting one of the best strategies. And surprise, surprise, just so you all know, split pushing tends to be on the weak side in League of Legends, whereas team fighting tends to be like a generally better strategy. Doesn't mean team fighting is always good, and it doesn't mean split pushing is complete trash, but we tend to move the game away from split pushing being the optimal strategy, because that tends to create like metas where it's like, well, actually this is pretty rough, even though like that could be a balanced version of the game, right? We tend to move the game away from strategies that are strong at ignoring the laning phase. Like if you take Janna top and ignore your lane opponent and run around and help the jungle, right? We tend to like move the game away from that, even though that might be a balanced, legitimate way to win the game at League of Legends. Like maybe that strategy isn't overpowered. It still is like, is that the best version of League of Legends when that's like one of the major strategies you're running into, right? And so again, it's like, you can create all these like objective versions of balance where it's like, technically this is fair, technically it loses the right amount, technically it wins the right amount. But that often competes with the subjective experience of this felt fair, this felt balanced, and certain characters feel more fair and balanced than others. And certain metas feel more fair and balanced than others. And certain strategies and build paths and all these different things. Yeah. So that's my take on balance. Is like is that the idea of objective balance is valuable, and tracking data to like get as good of an understanding as you can of how the game is balanced is really valuable, but you need to mix it with considering the subjective experience of your players. Because at the end of the day, people aren't going to play a game they don't enjoy. I'll cap it off too with also there's a limit in terms of like when we were talking about objective balance. Like you do want to think about limits. And what I mean by that is like, as an example, let's say there's a character who has like a 65% win rate and not many people care. You might want to do something about that. If that makes sense. Where it's like, you don't necessarily want players to be getting, what's a good way to describe it? You don't necessarily want players to be like getting scammed, right? Where it's like, you don't realize that Janna's move speed aura just automatically loses you the game if you're on the enemy team. And so even though you don't notice it, and even though you don't care about it, and even though you think it's fine, you're subtly getting scammed the entire time it's buffing Jax's move speed. And then you're like, that might not be something you want to maintain if it's like causing like significant flows of power, even if no one really minds. And that's something you also have to really consider. What I'm talking about, by the way, is Janna used to have, way back in the day, a global aura that gave 3% move speed. It was incredibly powerful. And it's one of those things where no one will ever complain about that unless they're like really in the know. Like, you know, like a pro jungler who knows what's going on might complain about it. Meteos probably would tell me, hey dude, Janna's aura, what's up with that? But overall, like an invisible aura that no one can see or intuit or notice, like no player is going to tell you, well, that's unfair. Sorry, I shouldn't say no. Very few players will like say, that's unfair. My subjective experience thinks I need to get rid of this. But every game that Janna was in, very subtly, the Jax on her team would just win. The jungler on her team would just win. The melee champions on her team would just win. The AD carry on her team would just casually escape, even when she wasn't there, right? And so you do want to be careful about things that can, like, I don't know, invisibly tilt players towards unfair outcomes in either extreme direction, even if subjectively the players don't notice it.